Welcome to Learn to Live Stress-Free. This is Christine Wright with Dr. Robert Wright, Jr., your go-to wellness coaches of www.stressfreenow.info. Our featured guest today is Dr. Allan Wilber-Combs, speaking on the role of consciousness in everyday life. Dr. Combs is the first endowed chair, Doshi Professor of Transformative Studies, and Director of the Center for Consciousness Studies at the California Institute of Integral Studies. His background is in consciousness studies, neuropsychology, and systems science. He also holds appointments at the Saybrook University and is Director of the Consciousness Evolution Program and the Graduate Institute of Connecticut. He is also Professor Emeritus at the University of North Carolina, Asheville. He is author of over 200 articles, chapters, and books on consciousness and the brain, including The Radiance of Being, Understanding the Grand Integral Vision, Living the Integral Life, winner of the Best Book Award of the Scientific and Medical Network of the UK with a foreword by Ken Wilber, Synchronicity Through the Eyes of Science, Myth and the Trickster with Mark Holland, Consciousness Explained Better Toward an Integral Understanding of the Multifaceted Nature of Consciousness, The Victorian's Guide to Consciousness, The Post-Conventional Personality, Empirical Perspectives on Higher Development with Angela Pfaffenberger and Paul Marco, and Dreamer of the Earth, The Relevance of Thomas Berry, Prophetic Visionary, with Ernest Laszlo. Dr. Combs is the founder of the Consciousness Society, a co-founder of the Society for Chaos Theory in Psychology and the Life Sciences, a member of the General Evolution Research Group, and the 100-member Club of Budapest. He is co-editor of the Journal of Consciousness Evolution and associate editor of Dynamical Psychology. Professor Combs was the winner of the 2002-2003 National Teaching Award of the Association of Graduate Liberal Studies Programs, and in the same year held the UNCA Honorary Ruth and Leon Feldman Professorship. Allan, we're honored to have you as our featured guest today. Welcome.
Thank you. Yes, Allan, I'm so happy that you could join us today.
Allan, would you tell us about yourself and what led you to do this auspicious work that you're currently doing?
Well, I think you already told folks quite a bit about myself, but I have always been interested in consciousness and the nature of consciousness and the nature of the mind, and this is what led me to develop a degree in psychology and essentially what led me to become a psychologist. Over the years, consciousness has become a topic of greater and greater interest and legitimacy throughout our culture and in universities as well as elsewhere. So I've had increasing opportunities to actually teach and work and write in the area of consciousness studies. So it's a labor of love, I would say. And most of my work deals with consciousness in some aspect or some way or other.
Thank you.
Leslie, how did you come to write your famous Radiance of Being book? I think our audience would really be interested in that. What was your biggest challenge in completing that work?
Well, the Radiance of Being, I had written a book on synchronicity with a co-author a few years earlier than that, and it's still on the market. It's called Synchronicity, and the subtitle changes some. Right now it's called, I think, Synchronicity in the Eyes of Science, Myth, and the Trickster. But when I wrote The Radiance of Being, quite some years back, I was at a point in my own life and career where I felt I had acquired enough experience, wisdom, and thought to begin to put it all together in one place. So that book was a kind of effort to create the world according to Combs, especially focusing on themes of consciousness and the growth of consciousness, the evolution of consciousness, and the role of consciousness in psychology. The term Radiance of Being actually is from a Tibetan poem of the Dzogchen tradition. But I spent several years writing that book and wrote chapters on each topic that had interested me over the years: mysticism, consciousness in the brain, evolution of consciousness, that is, has consciousness actually been changing over the course of human history, and if so, where is it going in the future? Who are the major players who have thought about evolution of consciousness? There are a few of them that are quite prominent, and we're actually hearing more and more about them today than when I wrote the book. So it was a book I spent several years writing and put a lot of myself into. It's kind of fortunate in a way that the timing of the book, people have pointed out that the book was actually written in the 90s, and so it's been a while. But yet, most of what's in it is not out of date, because the 1990s saw major theories of the brain and how the brain functions, which really haven't changed much since then. What we have now are devices for observing the brain, a living brain, what's going on in it, in detail, but those details haven't changed the big picture much. So the theories about mind and brain haven't really changed all that much. And of course, a great deal of thought about consciousness and experience and spirituality in its relation to consciousness have been sitting around for hundreds, if not thousands of years. So they haven't changed a lot either. So the book, I've thought about revising the book, but there's really not a lot in it that needs revised, except maybe just some of the references, and certainly could tune up the chapter on the brain and consciousness some, but there's nothing in there that's wrong. The basic ideas were here. The 1990s, you may recall, were the decade of the brain, it's called, and the major theories came forward at that time. It was a very productive time. So that book represented my life and my thinking right around the age of 50, I guess, a point in my life when I had thought about these things a long time and brought them all together. Ironically, well, a number of the book distributors, when we tried to find publishers, said, where do we put it? Do we put it under spirituality? Do we put it under religion? Do we put it under philosophy? And of course we said, put it under all of them. And it was really kind of ironic that some of the better publishers rejected it for being a kind of odd mixture of science and spirituality. I remember the MIT press rejected for that reason. Then they turned around 1 or 2 years later and published Zen in the Brain, and everything changed. So now the bookstores are full of books that have science, spirituality, and consciousness. But it's continued to be a good book that's sold quite a bit. And my more recent book, Consciousness Explained Better, when it came out 3 or 4 years ago, the Radiance of Being sales picked up again as people started reading books I had written, I guess. So that's a little history on the Radiance of Being, probably more than you wanted to know.
No, actually, that's just the tip of the iceberg that I wanted to get down to the base of the iceberg a little bit more. Mm-hmm. I have to tell you, Allan, that your Radiance of Being book, in a way, was very life-changing for me, when I read that. Uh-huh. I remember that there were several places where it was, well, I'll be honest with you. I can recall the first time that I picked up your book, I believe it was in 2007, and I said, what the heck is this? This is so dense. And I remember when you spoke at the Consciousness Society talk on your film panel, you talked about watching a movie and it being so complex, and then seeing it years later and that it didn't seem complex. And so that was my similar experience with your book. I remember picking it up in 2007, and I said, this is so dense. And so what is he really saying here? It's very complex. And then 3 years later, I remember reading it, and I said, I don't agree with what Leslie's saying here. Or this is interesting, but I wonder if Leslie thought about this or that. Yeah. And so that would be, on my part, where through your help and the help of other people at CIIS, that I think what happened was that the legs on my stools got knocked off. So the things that I used to think of as facts, quote unquote, they no longer, it changed my worldview, the paradigms. And so once that happens, and so here's the perfect example, because in my own study, this actually figures prominently. On page 51 and 52 of your Radiance of Being book, you mentioned the term catastrophic bifurcation. And I know many people, once they understand that term, will say, oh, yeah, that's happened to me in my life. Can you define that term for our audience and explain why you say it changes a person's life forever? And then in the book, you call it a liberating experience that hurdles consciousness directly out into the state of realization. And so, although that's a very flowery way of saying that you got your butt kicked, could you just go into that a little bit? Because I think many people experience that.
We had to get the whole context for that statement for it to make good sense. But I had done a lot of work earlier in my life in chaos theory, chaos mathematics, and chaos theory was construed by mathematicians in the 80s mostly, some in the 70s, and these guys are quite colorful, and they looked at patterns of activity that would repeat or almost repeat, and they said, well, these patterns, they refer to them as attractors. An attractor is something like the way a pendulum works in a clock. It's a pattern of activity that the system is drawn into. And they said, well, some of these attractors are strange. And so they called them strange attractors. Later they renamed them chaotic attractors. But they're activities like the human heartbeat that look very similar but are not exactly similar in each cycle. Or the weather, for example, day to day follows a rough cycle, but it's not exactly the same from day to day. Now, if something happens that dramatically changes that pattern, they call that a catastrophe. Okay, so the appearance of a tornado would be a catastrophe in terms of the weather. It just means a dramatic shift, and if it's a permanent shift, then the whole system is shifted. So I'm kind of using chaos theory language there, referring to the fact that a person can be in some pattern of behavior. You can have some pattern of behavior. It might be self-destructive, for example, and you stick in that pattern, you're stuck in that pattern. Addiction is like that, drug addiction. The person may be drawn to try to get out of it, but they're stuck in that pattern. It's an attractor, and in this kind of sense. And if something happens, it just blows them clear out of it. That's catastrophic. That would be a catastrophic bifurcation. Bifurcation means that the pattern changes. It becomes a different pattern. There are some schools of spiritual growth, for example, one or two famous Zen schools, where the master knows just when to clunk you on the head with a club, and suddenly you'll wake up. Those masters are hard to find, but there are good stories about it, and that's a catastrophic bifurcation for the person. Catastrophic in the sense that it's a sudden, dramatic change. Bifurcation, it just means it's a change. So I was talking in the book about different schools of spiritual growth and transformation, such as this northern school of Zen. It's famous for Zen masters who will ask a key question or even just clonk you with a stick and suddenly wake you up or suddenly cause a dramatic shift in consciousness. We were talking just before we started about Donald Epstein, who's a pretty dramatic chiropractor. He started the school of network chiropractic, and he works with subtle energies. I'm not a person that's very much into or interested in weird and wonderful things like subtle energies, but I've never seen anything like this guy. He invited me to a week-long workshop. He's very influenced by Ken Wilber. They both live in Boulder. They both used to live up on the same road, and they know each other well. And he invited me to come to one of these. It was a week-long meeting or a week-long session workshop in which he personally worked on a lot of us. There were about 40 of us And that we went through some pretty dramatic changes in our sense of who we were there. I don't know how he does it. He's an amazing guy. He has lots of practitioners that study with him, but he's the guy. I tell people it's a little like spending a week with Jesus Christ and seeing, him raise the dead and the various miracles and so on. And then his followers go out, but it's not quite the same thing. And at the end of that week, it turned out there were 3 or 4 of us that changed our names. And I started going informally by Leslie, which is my middle name. Well, I don't use it all the time because everything I've written is under Allan. But the change was so dramatic, I didn't want to forget about it. I wanted to something to remind me of the transformations I'd gone through. And my wife had similar ones. So that's a real story of a catastrophic bifurcation. It didn't happen in an instant, but it happened over just a few days.
That's so interesting. Can you just briefly explain, in that week-long workshop, since you mentioned he was in the chiropractic tradition, was he actually doing touching or spinal manipulation? The reason I ask is because I just recently came across some studies which have documented the release of nitric oxide spiking during spinal manipulation in the chiropractic setting. And so those are new studies and new findings which validate the work that I've been doing. So I'm wondering, did he actually touch people?
Well, he did some, but and the research you've read makes perfect sense to me. It's just that Donnie himself, he seemed to work with subtle energies a lot. And I don't know quite what that means, except that he didn't touch you a lot, but you got moved around by him. For example, my wife would lay on the chiropractic table, your face down, and he would somehow grab the air above her shoulders like there were strings there. And he would pull up, and she would come up by the shoulders. I swear to God. And she's laying there with her eyes shut. And that night, we looked at her shoulders when she took her shirt off, and she had big black and blue marks. Like,
oh, my.
Been hooked in there. He did a lot of that. He did a lot of work that would be almost like yogic work, holding various postures. He didn't do any of the traditional bone-popping chiropractic. He didn't criticize it. He just didn't do any of it. And one of my best friends is, and actually one of my students as well, both worked with him. They're both network chiropractors. And if you go to a session with them, they will touch you various places, encourage you to feel really comfortable and move around, and you probably will move around. You probably shake and twitch a bit here and there. But what happens is you feel better and better over a period of days afterwards. It's a really very strange business. There's no twisting or popping or anything. It's all very subtle. Although, again, I want to say Donnie doesn't criticize traditional chiropractors or find fault with them. It's just the way he works. But he did a lot more than just working with bones in the body. He had people doing these, what were very much like yogic breathing and postures. And eventually, before the week was over, he had people making affirmations that would affirm who they were and what they wanted to do with their lives. So it was also a growth workshop.
That's so interesting because when you said that his last name was Epstein, there's a guy, I don't know if you're familiar with him, a medical doctor in New York that has a certification program in energy medicine. His name is Gerald Epstein.
And they could be related.
Yeah, but we were surprised. We had been in New York all those years, and we had never heard of him. And when we finally caught up with him and his wife and saw what he does work with the subtle energies, and with the affirmations, and using his motto is imagery, and so it's very, very similar to what you're talking about. Okay, so Allan, let me ask you.
Let me just say one more thing about energy medicine. Now you're talking about it.
Okay.
It's fairly rare in the U.S., although I know people that do it, but it's widely accepted other places in the world. In Canadian hospitals, there are practitioners, essentially like nurses, doing energy medicine right there in the hospital.
Really?
Yeah. So it's a real deal, and people that know what they're doing can really do it. It's just one of those things the APA, AMA can't really regulate, not very happy with. So this guy may be quite an interesting guy. I don't know. So go ahead.
Okay.
I'm sorry. I just wanted to
Yes,
say.
thanks for that. And so I will definitely look up Donald Epstein, so I will not familiar
Donnie,
with
as he calls himself, is in Boulder, or I mean in Denver.
in Denver, Colorado.
Yeah,
okay,
if you remind me,
very good.
I can send an announcement or workshops I just got today. It's still sitting in my inbox, I think.
Wonderful, wonderful. Yeah. That'll be great. We can pass that information on. So, Leslie, let me ask you about this thing that's a burning issue on my mind. I've wanted to ask you for a long time. You're part of the famous Wilber-Combs matrix model duo.
Yeah.
Not everyone would be familiar with that. So can you tell our audience exactly what that is and why it's significant and how it came about?
Yeah, well, I started out as a physicist as an undergraduate, and so I have a way of looking at things that are a little bit more mathematical, or the way physicists might. And one of the things that was going on in the early 80s in transpersonal psychology, and Ken Wilber's work in particular, is what it was looking like is people would go through these growth stages, if they did. I mean, if a person is going through growth, something like you can see in spiral dynamics, for example, or a lot of other systems where you see the personality change and the person grow over a period of time. And what it was looking like was that as they got to the highest levels of personal growth, they were tapping into what you would call transpersonal or spiritual realms. Okay, so the problem that I kept worrying about with this was, wait a minute, on the one hand, we're talking about the growth of a person's personality. There are lots of theories about that, and there's lots been written about. As I said, spiral dynamics is possibly a good example. There are some others that have been researched much better, but how is it that we end up at the top of this system when people really, in theory, have grown to the highest levels, that we sort of shifted, we're shifting language. Ken Wilber and I both are shifting language, and suddenly we're using this language straight out of Indian philosophy, Vedanta, subtle realm, causal realm, and so on. These are sort of mystical states. And the more I thought about it, the less sense that made. It just seemed to me that we're getting things mixed up, that these are two different things. So I originally published something I called the Wilber. Well, I originally just called it. I'll tell you what I called it. Let me think a minute here. What do you call this thing? Table of elements in chemistry. So this was a table of consciousness. Is essentially what I called it. And the idea was that people experience all kinds of different states of consciousness, and that you can experience these states at any point in your development, but you will interpret them differently. So the idea was that, for example, a child who has a very low level of personality development and whose intellect is still intellect of a child can have some of these more subtle experiences that are described in mystical literature. For example, subtle, causal, or even non-dual experiences are some of the terms that are used there. So I came up with this, what I call the matrix, and Ken Wilber later called it a lattice, in which you've got levels of growth going vertically on one side, and then as you go across, you have these realms of being or levels of consciousness or realms of experience that are described in Vedanta and by mystics all over the world. So Ken Wilber, for example, refers to these as natural mysticism, deity mysticism, formless mysticism, and non-dual experience. In terms of Vedanta, you can think of these as the gross realm, physical realm we all live in, psychic realm, which is just behind the physical realm, and it's the center for energy, for example, subtle energies that are used in healing and so on, subtle realm beyond that, causal realm beyond that, and on to the non-dual realm. So I separated these two, in this table of what I call table of consciousness. And Ken picked that up, and he really developed it further. He used these names from traditional studies of mysticism: natural mysticism, deity mysticism, formless mysticism, and non-dual. Those are terms that had been used describing mystical experiences in Christianity as well as other religions, and he put those across from left to right, but stuck with the developmental stages going from the bottom to the top. But see, then you don't have them confused. You've got a person can grow in terms of their personality and their intelligence, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they experience these subtle realms. That's a different issue. And one of the other issues that came along with that Ken Wilber was really in trouble with early on, I think he would admit that without any difficulty, was the issue of childhood spirituality. According to the old model, it was a contradiction in terms. Children couldn't really be having spiritual experiences because their developmental level was so low. That these subtle and causal and non-dual experiences came only at the highest level of personal development, which took years and years and years, even for anyone. So children might have magical experiences, but they didn't have what you can legitimately call spiritual experiences. And Ken was quite adamant about that, created a lot of contention about it, as a matter of fact. Well, what this lattice, I'll tell you what I called it, periodic table of consciousness. You remember the periodic table of elements?
Of course, right.
Yes,
yeah. So I called this periodic table of consciousness and took it from William James. And William James had talked about states of consciousness, not in this way, but he experimented with psychedelic drugs at his time, and he was very interested in states of consciousness. Well, Ken Wilber took this and sorted it all out into these various mystical levels, which was a very nice move, and people in theology got quite interested. It was really a brilliant piece of work. So he took what I had and put it together in more traditional religious terms or spiritual terms in these levels of mysticism, but we still had this notion of vertical development, that is, development of the personality, closely related, but not quite the same thing as development of intelligence. And then the subtle realms or mystical realms is something different. So a child, for example, who is experiencing what Piaget would call magical consciousness, that is, understands the world in magical terms. For example, a child may tell you that it rains in the spring, so the flowers will come out in the summer. That's not wrong, but it's a magical explanation. It's not a cause and effect explanation. So a child who is thinking in magical terms may have a powerful experience of one of these subtle states and may come back and say, well, I was talking to, Jesus Christ or Mary Magdalene, or an angel came, or whatever. But it's going to be, and this was a point I made, it's going to be in the language and understanding framework of the child. Okay. Well, Ken read that and developed it further. He had actually said something like that way back, but hadn't really developed it. So he started publishing the whole thing in its new and developed form as the Wilber-Combs lattice or Wilber-Combs matrix. You might argue that it should be the Combs-Wilber lattice.
So wait, surprise.
Yeah, but, I have no problem with that because Ken tends to forget where he finds things anyway. I mean, Ken's one of these people that reads an enormous amount of stuff and he just synthesizes it all, and then he puts it out. And half the time, when I first met him, I accused him of not having an original idea in his head. Never had. That was our original. I said, you plagiarize. You don't have any ideas. I was really angry with him at the time. And, but yet there's some truth to it because he's a great synthesizer. And so he tends to overlook where he gets ideas because he's so interested in the ideas. So in some ways, I'm honored that he's carried me along, and he's always, whenever he talked about this, he's always talked about how we work on this together and so on and so forth. So I'm very happy with that. But it solved his problem about childhood spirituality, because then, instead of people calling him some kind of an ogre who thought that children, well, he actually one time said, you might as well talk about worms. It was like, they're not prepared for spiritual experience. Well, once we got into this model, then it was no longer a problem. And Ken himself wrote about how children could have these very real, subtle experiences, but that, and this is the bottom line for this matrix, is people will explain their experiences in whatever language level they're at. So we had astronauts went out into space, and they all had these powerful experiences, essentially mystical experiences. And, at least one of them, I don't have the names in front of me, at least one of them came back and became a very active fundamentalist, Christian fundamentalist. Another one came back, I think it was Edgar Mitchell, was it? Started the Noetics Institute.
Yeah.
Because he had this vision of the whole cosmos as a kind of harmonious universe. Now, that's a very high level of understanding things. And so he created the Noetics Institute to expand human knowledge into realms that hadn't really been looked at. And, he's still alive, and the Noetics Institute's still very, very active. So the point is that people will have powerful experiences, but they'll talk about them in whatever framework they have, whatever their world is like. So that's been the advantage of the Wilber-Combs lattice or matrix. By the way, there's a little YouTube of a talk I gave on this. It's quite humorous. That if you look Wilber-Combs lattice, if you Google it, you'll get this immediately comes up. It's about 5 minutes worth. Anybody wants to watch it, it's kind of funny. I have a lot of these things that were drawn by children that I show in this little talk.
I think right after this interview, Leslie, I think I will take a look at it. I must say how very impressed I am listening to all that you've told, and I'm ready to engage in a high level of play. First, I love the choices of names that I have for you, shifting from Allan to Leslie to honor your transformation.
Yeah, that worked well for me because it's my middle name anyway. It was my father's name. He had recently died, so in a sense the name was available.
I like it.
It's an old family name to boot. My daughter's middle name is Leslie, so it really works.
Wow.
See, there's a story behind it, and as I listen to you, I see that you are quite a storyteller.
Well,
and certainly when I go in for my transformation, I'm going to ask my Zen master if he would allow if I could have my transformation with a question rather than a stick.
Yeah, but the stick is faster.
No. The question will do. Now,
okay.
Leslie, for the average layperson like myself, can you define integral consciousness for our audience?
Yeah, well, I actually think it's a bad term in some ways because it means different things to different people. And I've talked to Ken about this at length, and he pretty much agrees with me. It's been used, probably the first person who used the term integral consciousness was the great Indian sage Sri Aurobindo early in the 20th century, and what he meant was a very high level of spiritual realization. And that was kind of the way he talked about integral consciousness. What was integral about it is it would bring together mind, body, spirit, and various levels of spirit into one unified being. So that's a very spiritual and in some ways very traditional Indian way of thinking of integral consciousness. Sri Aurobindo was not a traditional Hindu, but yet he drew on those ideas a lot and integrated them with the idea of evolution of the spirit. So he used the term, although the way he used it, I don't think is probably the way most people, certainly in the West, use it. John Gepser, the great European cultural historian of the mid-20th century, was the next person that used integral consciousness a lot. Gepser, we could talk all day about Gepser, but he saw the history of human experience as going through several stages. A kind of archaic stage, a magical stage, characterized by life in small groups of people, pre-civilization, and magical understandings of nature and the universe. And that was sort of the spirituality of shamanism, for example. And then mythic consciousness we see in the great mythic stories of the Greeks and Egyptians and all around. And then rational mental consciousness that came along after that. Well, for Gepser, if you can get all of these going together, because all of these collect in the modern human being, then that's what integral consciousness is. It's living all of these different levels of consciousness in oneself all the time. So for Gepser, integral consciousness meant that you loved and enjoyed the magical consciousness inside of you that is the basis of things like love, for example, is magical, and music is magical, that we experience the mythic in our religion and in the stories we tell, and we appreciate those. We don't try to make them literal, but we certainly enjoy them. And then, but yet we have a rational mind that we use and keep ourselves sort of grounded in reality with it. And we get all those going at once. And then there's another step that comes along at that point where people sort of break out of the three-dimensional way of seeing the world and experience the world in a what he called diaphanous way, a more translucent way, illuminated way that's basically spiritual. And you see this a lot in some of the modern art, especially not real modern art, but especially I think the Impressionists, for example, painted the world with light and luminosity. That was very much an integral kind of vision or experience as Gepser developed it. And it's my own inclination because from this point of view, Gepser's integral consciousness means being a whole human being, of enjoying all the different aspects of life and living them all yourself. Wilber doesn't really like the magic very much and doesn't really care much for the mythic either. He's a very rational guy. I always think of Wilber as a kind of like Apollo, is this brilliant light of the intellect. Yeah, well, no, I'm serious. He's very Apollonian. Everything is lit by this brilliant intellect, and so he doesn't care much for these. And this is the only point where he and I really differed. Is he's not interested in keeping the magical and mythic. He's interested in going for the highest level of rationality and then beyond that. So for Wilber, integral consciousness is sort of a moving target. It's to realize the highest level of personality development that's available, because this changes over a period of time with history, and being able to realize the highest stages or the highest structures of experience as well. So this constantly changes, and in fact, this is the point where Wilber and I kind of disagree, although I've talked to him in depth about it, and certainly, if I can say this politely and lovingly, he is as confused as anyone because we're trying to throw in everything but the kitchen sink in this kind of way of approaching it. I personally, and I don't mean that in a derogatory way, I think Ken's trying to map together what would be the highest level of personal, cognitive, mental growth with the highest level of spiritual growth. These are constantly changing as the human race evolves, so it's a moving target. I personally don't think it's a very useful concept. I think whatever system of growth and transformation you get involved with, you can practice integral yoga a la Aurobindo and his partner, the mother. You can be a Zen practitioner. You can be a Eastern Orthodox, follow a kind of mystical spiritual path, or even a Western Orthodox Catholic. They're all different paths, and there's some argument about which ones go the furthest up the hill, but I don't think that's very productive. I think what's productive is to get involved in some authentic path, whether it's the Hebraic, Jewish or Christian or Taoist or whatever it is, and just go for that. and develop, I tend to be very Taoist in my own thinking. I claim to be a Quaker Taoist. Buddhist.
That's an interesting term.
Yeah, well, my daughter was over across at the neighbors when we lived in North Carolina. They tried to take her to church. Do you go to church? Does your family go to church? And she said, well, my stepfather is a Quaker. My own father is an Abyssinian Christian. My mother is an atheist, but partly Jewish. And she went through this whole list. and finally they said, well, that's fine. You just stay home. Yeah, but, that's kind of American spirituality. I think Ram Dass is a good example of American spirituality. A Jewish guy who went to, India, became involved in Hindu religion there, but a lot of what he does looks a whole lot more like Taoism to me. So, yeah.
I think that you've covered the whole range.
I try. Yeah, well, I pick and choose. I mean, that's kind of what yoga is to me. It's a practice. It's not a belief system, and you just find what works for you.
Yes, I really enjoyed listening to that, and certainly whatever mix we find of the magical and the rational and the spiritual, it is a journey and it is a path. Leslie, you've had a very long and distinguished teaching career at the university level. I know as a coach and as a teacher myself of elementary and high school students that can be a very rewarding experience. Could you tell us how that has played in your life?
Well, I've been very lucky. I have spent most of my career in quality undergraduate liberal arts colleges, and these are places where both my colleagues and the students were a pleasure to be with, and there's not a lot of pressure to publish constantly, although that you are expected to do some scholarship, and I always did because I enjoyed doing it. But it was a career in which, I could get up every morning and do just what I most wanted to do, and that worked fine. I enjoyed teaching. I enjoy writing. I really was very lucky. I kind of went through this system in what is sometimes now called the golden age for college teaching. That is the 60s through about the late 80s, when there really was a lot more support and money in higher education than there is now. So this was a great time to be a college professor. So it's been very rewarding to me. I mean, being naturally an intellectual, bookish person, somebody who likes to read and think about things, and also being someone who likes to talk about them and hang out with students, I've really enjoyed it a lot. I remember my committee chair in graduate school, he got frustrated with me one day. He says, what you want to do is be a teacher at a undergraduate university, then you could go to the coffee shop and hang out all day with your students. And so, in fact, that's pretty much what I did, and loved every minute of it. I really love hanging out with students. They have fresh ideas. They're fun to be with. I never have been in a big competitive research institution where I had, to worry about how many publications I had and so on. So it's been very pleasant for me, and I still advise students that if they want a career in which they have a reasonable amount of freedom, the satisfaction of being a teacher and so on, if they can find a good liberal arts school, that's great. There's a lot of junior colleges that are good, but they tend to work you really hard. They're more like high schools, in the sense that if you're a faculty member at a junior college, you're likely to literally teach all day. And if you're at a big research institute, then you're under a lot of pressure to produce. So I think I had the best of all worlds. I spent most of my career at the University of North Carolina at Asheville, which is a delightful little town. Wonderful place to raise my children, and was intellectually rich without being under a lot of pressure. So that worked out very well for me.
That's wonderful. You were very fortunate, and I do really want to acknowledge, Leslie, the role you played in Bob's life. You were the reason that he sought out working with you at CIIS, and you were there at the end when he completed his program to
my
put that
pleasure
on him.
Yeah, it's one of the great rewards to see for my job to see people like Bob go off and then do their own work and become their own person and do wonderful creative work like you guys are doing.
Thank you so much, and I tell you, it's been a growth experience for me, too, because many times I tell Bob I have absolutely no clue what he's talking about because I can't pronounce those words that you taught him and that he uses.
Oh, no, I made a big mistake here.
Not at all.
That's funny. Yeah.
Now, Leslie, would you tell our listeners how they could work with you or contact you?
Well, if someone wants to contact me, I have a number of email addresses that all get to me. Probably the easiest one is Combs, ACOMBS, at CIIS.edu.
Okay, excellent. And
yeah, but let me just say, for those who have a bad memory like I do, if you Google my name as Allan Combs on the web, I have a website, and I have an email address on there. You can click right through. Or if you go to the website for the California Institute of Integral Studies, I have a an email address there. So I'm not hard to find. I've got email addresses all over the place.
Okay, beautiful.
Yeah,
now,
I never try to keep mine hidden. I just use a lot of spam control.
Okay, beautiful. All right, so listeners, if you would like to get in touch with Dr. Allan Leslie Combs, just email him at acombs@ciis.edu.
Yeah, that works well. Let me
inject
inject something very quickly here.
Oh, yes, certainly.
If you go to the CIIS website, you'll see we have many wonderful programs for those of you who want to work in the area of health and especially psychologically, somatic psychology and clinical psychology and other areas of psychology in the helping professions, as well as the more academic fields like I'm in. And we've just integrated with a well-certified Chinese school, so we're going to have Chinese medicine as well. So feel free to come and shop around and see if we have any programs that appeal to you.
Okay, very good, excellent. So, listeners, those of you who are looking for a program, do check out the California Institute of Integral Studies. That's CIIS.edu, and you can email Leslie there at acombs@ciis.edu. Thank you.
You bet.
Great. Leslie, before we wrap up our interview, since you recently returned from a speaking gig in Paris, France, can you tell us a little bit about the presentation you did there and how enjoyable that trip was for you and your wife, Julie?
Oh, it was a wonderful trip. I've never really spent much time in Paris, so we spent 2 weeks eating our way across the city. But an old friend, Rupert Sheldrake, the Morphic Fields guy, was there for the talk, and so we got to hang out together a little bit and have dinner together. There were some other folks there I know as well. Elizabeth Sarturis, who's very interested in deep ecology and environmental issues. And there was a well-known Buddhist priest there, better known in Europe, Matthew Ricard, M-A-T-T-H-I-E-U, Matthew Ricard, R-I-C-A-R-D. He was the interpreter for the Dalai Lama. He also has an advanced degree in molecular biology, and he actually has a cover story in a recent Scientific American on meditation in the brain, he and one or two other authors. So it was a one-day workshop on the evolution of consciousness by a group there that are very interested in the evolution of consciousness, and so it was a lot of fun. You can actually find it on the web if you want to hear the talks. The talks are actually all on the web. You probably had to fish a little bit, but it's under evolutionconscience.com, all one word, evolutionconscience. It's French, Evolution Conscience. There's an English version of the website, too, but I had to fish for it a little bit. But we all gave talks, and you can hear my talk there. It's about an hour long, and I really, if you're interested in Rupert Sheldrake and his thinking, he gave quite a delightful talk. And then Elizabeth, she's very interested in environmental issues and and gave quite a nice talk too. There are some other people that talk, but those are the main ones I would emphasize. So it was a great trip, and I really enjoyed it, and I'm ready to go back to Paris and start eating more, although I'm very sorry there have been some events in Paris that have been very unhappy in the last few days. So
yes, we saw that news. It's quite tragic. Leslie, what final thoughts or key idea would you like our audience to take away from today's broadcast?
Well, I really hadn't thought about that, but I think the thing is to just keep working towards becoming more completely yourself.
Okay, great. That's a great answer.
Leslie, I'd like to thank you for being our featured guest today. I know our audience has enjoyed you immensely, and I'd like to thank you, our listeners, for listening in, wherever you are, in whatever time zone you are in. We welcome and look forward to your comments about our show. Please contact us through our website with your feedback and suggestions. Remember, listeners, if you'd like to experience the same benefits our coaching clients get with us and learn how to get control of your schedule or easy ways to dissolve your chronic pain, stress, or anxiety, feel free to call us at 954-900-2179. Mention that you heard our Stress Free Now podcast show, and your first session is absolutely free. Call today to schedule your appointment. For Christine Wright, this is Dr. Robert Wright, Jr. of www.stressfreenow.info. Until next time, be safe and be well.